Benvenuti. Welcome to New York University, Casa Italiana, Zerilli-Marimò. It's a great pleasure to have you all here with us tonight. We are very excited about this event. And before we start, I want to just recognize in the audience a couple of people. First, I want to recognize the presence of Chiara Zerilli and her husband, Riccardo Kulczyski. Chiara is the daughter of Baroness Mariuccia Zerilli-Marimò. From your applause, I understand that you know who I'm talking about. Mariuccia Zerilli-Marimò is the woman who made this place possible, who had the vision to create it, and with generosity, hard work, and enlightenment, proceeded until she realized it, and we hope we honor her vision with the work that we do every day, including with this event. I would also like to recognize the presence of Dolores Alfieri, who is Director of Italian-American Affairs for Governor Andrew Cuomo. And members of our board, thank you, Dolores. Members of the board of Casa Italiana, friends, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce this evening tonight. As you know, the title that we gave to the evening is Richard Gere reads Italo Calvino. And specifically, Mr. Gere is going to read from the new English translation of one of Calvino's most important book, The Baron in the Trees. It's a new translation that just came out. There are copies of the book upstairs if you want to buy one. And it's a new translation by Ann Goldstein, who unfortunately is not here with us tonight, but she has been a guest on our stage many, many times. She's one of the most prominent literary translations from the Italian, and she did a fantastic job, as we said, breathing new life into the works of Italo Calvino. We are going to discover why Mr. Calvino is interested, or why Mr. Gere is interested in Calvino during the Q&A. Our evening is going to be very simple. Mr. Gere is going to read a couple of passages from The Baron in the Trees, and Giovanna Calvino and myself are going to ask him questions. It's going to be a little discussion, and probably we'll also invite a few questions from the audience. Elliot, don't go anywhere. There are seats here. And so before further ado, I would like to introduce my guest. Giovanna Calvino is the daughter of Italo Calvino. She's a scholar. She has a PhD from University of Pennsylvania. And very proudly, we can say that she was a visiting professor in this Department of Italian Studies for many years. Richard Gere is an American actor and activist. He began acting in 1970. Among his films, I'm sure each of you has a favorite Mr. Gere film. I just want to remind Runaway Bride, Primal Fear, First Night, and his latest films are Norman and The Dinner. And without further ado, I would like to ask you to please welcome Giovanna Calvino and Richard Gere.
Hi, thank you for being here. Richard is going to read the first pages of The Baron in the Trees, and for those who don't know this novel, I just want to summarize it very quickly. It's set in the 18th century, and it's the story of an aristocratic family where the eldest son rebels, and in his anger towards his family, he decides to climb on a tree that is right outside of the house, and during his whole life, he will never get down. He will spend his whole life in the trees without ever touching the ground again. So these are the first couple of pages that Richard will read for us. Thank you.
And while Mr. Gere takes the podium, I would like to say that there are 4 seats here in the first and second row. If the event has started, so there are no more reserved seats, please sit down.
The microphone?
Buonasera, 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 buonasera. This is such a wonderful event, and I hope it's very loose and very easy. You know, I was riding over here with a friend, and I realized I'm here just to honor Italo Calvino. I think we all are. So you should feel that this is just a very loose celebration of him and his words, his language, and his mind. So I wish I could read this in Italian, but I can't. So this is actually the very beginning of the book. This is chapter 1 in the very beginning here. It was the 15th of June in 1767 when Cosimo Pievasco di Rando, my brother, sat among us for the last time. I remember as if it were today. We were in the dining room of our villa in Ambrosa, the windows framing the thick branches of the great holm oak in the park. It was midday, and our family, following the old custom, sat down to dinner at that hour, even though among the nobility it was now the fashion, inspired by the late rising court of France, to dine in the middle of the afternoon. The wind was blowing in from the sea, I remember, and the leaves were stirring. Cosimo said, "I told you I don't want it, and I don't," and he pushed away the plate of snails. Never had such grave disobedience been seen. At the head of the table was the Barone Arminio Pievasco di Rando, our father, wearing his wig long over his ears in the style of Louis XIV, out of fashion in this as in so many of his habits. Between me and my brother sat the Abbé Fauchelevent, my family's almoner, and the tutor of us boys. Across from us was the Generalessa Corradina di Rando, our mother, and our sister, Battista, the house nun. At the other end of the table, opposite our father, sat, dressed in the Turkish style, the Cavaliere Avocado Ennio Silvio Carrega, the administrator and hydraulic engineer of our estates, and as the illegitimate brother of our father, our natural uncle. Several months earlier, when Cosimo turned 12 and I 8, we had been admitted to our parents' table, or rather, I had benefited prematurely from my brother's promotion so that I wouldn't be left to eat alone. I say benefited only as a manner of speaking. In reality, for both Cosimo and me, the happy times were now over, and we felt regret for the meals in our little room, the two of us alone, with the Abbé Fauchelevent. The Abbé was a withered, wrinkled old man who had a reputation as a Jansenist and had in fact fled the Dauphiné, his native land, to avoid a trial by the Inquisition. But the strict character that was usually praised by everyone, the inward severity that he imposed on himself and others, constantly yielded to a fundamental inclination to apathy and indifference, as if his long meditations, eyes staring into emptiness, had led only to a great boredom and lethargy, and in even the least effort, he saw the sign of a destiny that it was useless to oppose. Our meals in the company of the Abbé began after long prayers, with orderly, decorous, silent movements of spoons, and woe to you if you raised your eyes from the plate or made even the slightest sucking sound as you sipped the broth. But by the end of the soup, the Abbé was tired, bored. He gazed into space and clicked his tongue at every swallow of wine, as if only the most superficial and transient sensations could reach him. By the main course, we had already started eating with our fingers, and we finished our meal throwing pear cores at each other while the Abbé every so often let out a lazy "ou bien" hello. Now, instead, as we dined with the family, childhood's sad chapter of daily grievances took shape. Our father and our mother were always right in front of us. We had to use knives and forks for the chicken and sit straight and keep elbows off the table, endless. And then there was our odious sister, Battista. A succession of scoldings, spiteful acts, punishments, obstinacies began until the day Cosimo refused the snails and decided to separate his lot from ours.
Well, maybe not in Italian, but the Italian names you pronounce perfectly. No, not at all. I always get my tongue twisted when I try to pronounce these long, elaborate names, so great job.
No, I remember making a movie with Kurosawa, and I did it all in Japanese. I didn't have any idea what I was saying. I learned it phonetically, and to this day I keep asking my Japanese friends, was it okay? And they said, well, you had one word wrong for fish, but you did it with such charm, it doesn't matter.
So the next challenge is Italian, probably. And the first question that everybody's asking me since we announced this evening is, how come Richard Gere is reading Italo Calvino in public? What is the reason, as if there is a specific one? How did you get interested in Calvino, and in particular in this book?
Well, first of all, I'm just curious, how many people here have read Il Barone? About half the people here. That's great. Is this on? Yeah. You know, I first heard about this book from a very dear friend of mine, and I can't remember the context which he brought it up, but he had been writing a screenplay and finished a screenplay on this book that he had written with Louis Malle, and for Louis Malle, and it was the first screenplay he'd ever written. He's a wonderful writer. And he actually happens to be sitting right over here, Jonathan Cott. And, I won't make him stand up because he'll probably leave if he does. So, but he gave me. He had been working on this, and he was a very close friend. And I don't remember if I had inquired or he offered it to me or whatever. But I read the script and it was beautiful, beautiful. And I read the book from that, and I realized he'd done an incredible job on the screenplay, but just what an extraordinary work of art it was, the book. And I remember one of the first books that I ever read as a young man, a John Barth book called The Sotweed Factor, which probably is not very well known right now, but there was a time when that book was quite famous. And there was something of this in that. It was of the same time in America, and had this picaresque quality to it, fairy tale quality to it. And I think it put me in that frame of mind of timelessness, history, of who are we, where did we come from, what are our dreams, a kind of a generosity of spirit. This book is saturated with a generosity and a sense of love and care and concern. Simple, it doesn't wear its heart on its sleeve, but it's inherent. Maybe we'll talk about Italo. I never met Italo, so what kind of a man he really was. But there's incredible warmth in this book, and it embraces the reader as the characters are embraced in the story.
Question for Giovanna, following up actually on this. Tell us something give us a context for this book. When your father writes it, what he had written before, and what were the expectations at this time, and if there is any particular reason why, at a certain point in his career, he starts writing these 3 books that, as we know, are part of a trilogy.
My father would say that the biggest work of his life was a book he rewrote called Italian Folk Tales, where he did the work that the brothers Grimm did, but he did it for Italy. He studied in libraries all over Italy and collected folk tales that were, most of them were in dialect. They had been transcribed, but they were not in Italian. They were in all these different dialects, and he compiled and rewrote them, and it took him a very long time. And I think that he was in this world, when in this mental world, when he started on the trilogy. It's called Our Ancestors, and the first book was called The Cloven Viscount, and it's the story of an Italian nobleman in the 12th century who goes to the Crusades, and he gets hit by a cannonball that splits him in half. And one half is extremely good, and the other half is extremely evil. And then he wrote The Baron in the Trees, and the third book is called The Non-Existent Knight, and it's the story of a knight in the army of Charlemagne, who is an extraordinary knight with a shiny armor. And the only issue is that inside the armor there is nothing. So that was the third book of the trilogy.
Thank you, Giovanna. And going back to Mr. Gere and The Baron in the Trees, so there is a script for this film. Are you still thinking about making this film? What is preventing you?
Richard Calvino is preventing it. Now, the book...
Richard Calvino being Giovanna's mother.
And, yes, the long time... How long were they together?
They met in 1962,
So
maybe,
30
and
years.
he died in 1985.
Yeah, so a long time.
Intense.
She's a piece of work. She is Chichita. She's Argentinian, yeah?
She's going to watch this video, you know.
Oh, sorry. No. First of all, I love her dearly. She's the most intelligent, charming, creative, warm, loyal, generous person I've ever met.
She's deaf, so maybe she won't.
So anyhow, Jonathan wrote a script that was the book. And he came up with this incredible device, which is how do you tell this whole story? Because they start when cousin was 12 years old, yeah. And he goes until he's in his 80s. And how can you do that? And 2 hours of a movie and make transitions. And hopefully you don't have 8 actors playing the same part. Well, Jonathan came up with the idea that when he goes off with the Spanish noble village in the trees, and he has his first sexual experience, that the next morning he is the adult character. And it was just a brilliant filmic way of telling the story of how he matures. And then you have your adult actor playing the rest of the story. I thought it was incredible. I was obsessed, and we were talking just before we came down here. It seemed to me that it had a richness to it if you placed it in America. Almost everything would be the same, but wilder, crazier. And it would be, what I wanted to make was an American Tom Jones, in a way. That all the foibles and the craziness of being a human being were there, but with this central leap of imagination of a boy who grows up in the trees and never comes down. In a wild country, which is still a wild country like America, you still have nature that you come outside of New York. You're 5 minutes out of New York, and you're in a wild forest. It's extraordinary. You can go tree to tree all over this country, from here to the West Coast. And it just felt incredible to me. Using slave culture as the local poor people. Using Native Americans also in this story seemed to me ways of even bringing more life to it. And I'm still obsessed with doing that. So Chichita, if you're out there somewhere, every couple of years I try again with her to try to get the rights. And it's almost there, and at the last second she pulls back. So perhaps if you would all ask her, if you're right now, she's watching this. If you just said, please, Chichita, can you do that for me, please? Please, Chichita. Thank you. That will do it, I'm sure. It'll be done now. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Giovanna, you'll be the one that has to bring the message to your mother and the lobbying that came from this room as well.
My mother didn't want to share Richard with me, so I think she's a bit cross.
That you're seated there instead of her. And Giovanna, going back to what Mr. Gere was saying about the trees and the fascination of the protagonist of the book, of the Barone for trees and nature and the forest, and the fact that he decides never to come down again. These might have to do with some of your real ancestors, not the mythical ancestors that your father created probably for you before you were born. So tell us something about who your ancestors were and how they can be somehow related to this story. Not the characters, but the backbone of the story.
My father's ancestors, he would never talk about them with me. And so I grew up with this idea, with no idea, with the idea of a blank. And he was actually opposed to, so his mother came from a village in Sardinia that was and had the same last name of the guy who wrote the Italian national anthem. And it was a tiny town, and my father denied categorically that they were related. So it's only negative ancestry. But I did meet my grandmother, and I do know quite a bit about my grandfather. And they were, he was an agronomist, and she was a botanist. She was one of the first women to graduate from university in Italy. She was a well-known scientist when my grandfather started corresponding with her. And he was specialized in tropical climates. And so he spent a lot of time in Mexico. And then he was supposed to go to Cuba, and he asked my grandmother to marry him and to accompany him to Cuba, and this is why my father was born there. And they lived for plants. It was their entire life, and my grandfather knew the name of each straw of grass my father regretted that he did not, that in his own rebellion, he refused to learn the names for each tree and each plant. But the concern for the environment came from there. And they were proto-environmentalists. They, at the beginning of the 20th century, they were talking about the ecosystem and how, in order to keep the birds of the region, you need to protect the flora of the area. And that whole area of Italy, the Riviera, which was beautiful, was then completely destroyed by the real estate speculators. And my father wrote about that also. He kind of predicted what happened to the garden where he grew up. Was not a beautiful garden, it was a scientist's garden. My grandfather imported the grapefruit and the avocado to Italy and maybe to Europe for the first time. So there were hundreds of different varieties of avocado trees. And then the mayor of Sanremo when my grandmother died, he got the land and he raised everything to the ground and built apartment buildings, so it's all gone. And anyway, so my ancestors, in a way, are those described in the books. That's how I fill the emptiness, that space in my mind. So I feel very familiar with all these characters.
Mr. Gere, going back to the Italian folktales that Giovanna mentioned, I understand you also read them when you were a young man. Any impression on those and the relationship, if you see any or none, between the fairy tales and the Baron in the Trees, that is a sort of following step in Calvino's writing?
Yeah, I don't remember it that well. We were talking before. I think the first time that I was aware of Calvino was, I don't know, somewhere mid-late 20s. Someone gave me the collection of folktales. And you know, they're dark. Some of them are incredibly dark and challenging.
If you read them to an American child, they might take away custody.
They're out there, but look, there's something of Borges in his writing. There's something of Marquez in his writing. There's something they're on the same planet for sure, these writers, and they're coming out of the same time, the same kind of world history. There is a Latin sensibility to these writers who have unfettered imaginations and unfettered in terms of their psychology and their willingness to go into dark, unconscious zones and willingness to express that. I think that's why they're so modern and will always be modern, because the willingness to go to dark places and find truths there that we don't normally have the courage to encounter. Il Barone is a different animal to me. And it's just the pure delight. You know, in terms of films, it reminds me a bit of one of my favorite films, Babette's Feast. I don't know if you've seen this movie. Also is a bit of a folktale short story. It's with a center of incredible generosity to it. There's a strictness to it. It's strictly written and strictly as a film, strictly composed and presented. And I think there's a strictness to Calvino's work also. It's very, it's not Jack Kerouac. Isn't something who sat down and just typed. This was, I have a feeling he labored over every word in these works. But there's something about Il Barone that to me, it's a warmth of the world that I would like to live in. That has its challenges for sure, and heartache and pain and broken lives and violence. But it's the world of dreams as opposed to nightmares. And I think that's why I think a movie of it would be something that would be completely timeless, and strangely probably G-rated. You know, this is a story of his that anyone could go and see. You could take your kids to see this.
Giovanna, before we move forward in the discussion, maybe you want to tell us something about another precedent of a story of your father that was turned into a movie, unauthorized in Italy and sort of declared and stated in the US. It's a curiosity I think many of our audience members don't know about.
Yes, this is something that maybe it can be interesting for the Italian audience, because it's a movie called I soliti ignoti, which is a
big deal on Madonna Street in this country. Yeah.
With Mastroianni and Gassman. And the screenwriters, so the movie came out in 1958, and the story is really the same story as a story my father wrote called Furto in una pasticceria, robbery in a pastry shop. And it's this band of criminal losers who dig a tunnel to get into a bank, but they go to the wrong place. The character, the principal character in the movie is called Cosimo, like in The Baron. But and years later, because Scarpelli was our neighbor in Tuscany, in our summer house, they became friends, him and my father, and Scarpelli admitted that yes, they had stolen the idea without ever acknowledging it, but it's a wonderful movie, so it's, I guess it's okay.
And there was an American film that came out a few years ago, Palookaville, where they said they
yes.
were inspired by
Yes, and
Italo
it was a
Calvino.
lovely independent movie.
I loved it,
yeah.
Palookaville.
Palookaville. With, I don't remember his name.
Woody Allen
No.
No. Yes, it's true. It's true. Yes. It's true. I forgot that. Yes, Woody Allen also. But Woody Allen was inspired by I Soliti Ignoti. He probably didn't know where it.
And Giovanna, when the book came out, and it came out after the Fiabe, after the folktales, and also after the beginning novel of your father, Il Sentiero dei Nidi di Ragno, The Path to the Spider Nest, that was his esordio, his beginning, and very controversial at the beginning, because it's a novel that talks about the resistance and the anti-fascist struggle in which your father took part, but it did not quite fit the canons of the literature that in Italy described this period at that time. And maybe you want to tell us something about this, and then the further reaction to The Baron in the Trees. For some people it was amazing, and for some people it was a big disappointment, because it seemed to stray away from that sort of more politically engaged tradition.
My father grew up during fascism. That's all he knew since he was born, and then the war broke out and he decided to become a resistant. He refused to be a soldier for Mussolini, and he also became a communist, which at the time he was an idealist and he knew very little. And after the war, he went to the Soviet Union. He made a trip that really bothered him, but he wanted to be ideological. But anyway, that's something else. So he wrote this novel about the war, seen from the point of view of a child, and he showed that that being fascist or being a resistant, it happened by chance, and that these partisans, these warriors, they could be very stupid also, and so he didn't make heroes out of the partigiani, even though that's the side that won the war and that's the side he was on. So he was criticized for that, for not being communist enough. And then when he wrote The Baron in the Trees, he was also very much criticized for this frivolous fairy tale about an aristocratic family. And other people said, no, but it's a whole metaphor about communism, and that made him very mad. And he left the Communist Party. He was quite bitter about it. Anyway.
It was the year before 1956, right?
Yes.
Because of the invasion of Hungary.
The invasion of Hungary, yeah.
And we were talking about this before, and you were saying, but it's a very political book, and it is on some level. On what we were saying, it's like the most noble part of politics. Do you want to tell us something about why do you see this also as a book with a political undertone, even if it's not party politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more of an. I would never use the word political. I think it's a humanist story. And that's why he kind of avoided the whole polemic of 20th century politics and went back to Rousseau and the natural man that was inclusive, that the animals, the trees, the human beings were all living in a universe that ultimately had to respect each other. all of its elements. As I recall in the book, he writes the manifesto of the trees, and it's a very humanist document that he writes of how we can live together, not how we can destroy each other, not how we can fight each other, but how we can live with each other. And I think that's the kind of warmth that was inherent in this. And maybe it was, I didn't realize his background, but maybe a reaction to the kind of anger that was inherent in a lot of those political discussions on both sides.
And reading his work as an adult, I had the impression that he was, even though he was very much anti-clergy, he grew up when the church in Italy had huge political power. But I think his books are very spiritual, and there is a kind of pantheism or Buddhism almost in the respect for everything, and in his desire to write from the point of view of the universe, you know, to transcend the ego. That was his aim. He said, how well would I write if I were not there? And this, that I say, would make the Italian wonderful specialists of his work very mad. And they would say that I am completely stupid, because there is still...
Long live the stupid people. That's all I can say.
Yes, there is still a very much political way of approaching his work. So
I think, as you say, I think it's probably one of the things, I wouldn't normally say this, but I think it's probably why it hits me quite deeply, because I think there is a yearning to make sense of things in the deepest sense of things. Even using the word in this translation, emptiness. When he says the abbé looked off into emptiness. Emptiness is a Buddhist term. It's not nothingness. It's not vacant. It's emptiness is a very specific term, which is Buddhistic. Things are empty. They exist, but they're empty of inherent existence, which allows them to express all things equally, because there's no point where reality or subject or object are caught. Everything is in motion, constantly. The humanist side, I mean, Rousseau was basically a Buddhist. You know, if you read those writings, the same way Walt Whitman was a Buddhist. This is an inclusive mind. It's not. There's no anger that this is coming out of. One of the problems with communism, I mean, even the Dalai Lama says basically he's a communist because he believes in the higher aspects. Why it's never worked is because it's been angry. And the anger can only come from a very hard, damaged ego. And that's what we have to transcend, which is how you're describing your father's work. And I think that's something that touches me very deeply.
I think with this we could have the second excerpt that Mr. Gere is going to read for us. There is a confrontation between father and son. I understand. Maybe you want to tell us something more,
Yes,
Giovanna.
this is still towards the beginning of the novel, and the Baron, the father of Cosimo, cannot forgive him for what he did, and he also, for dynastic reasons, he would like his son to inherit the title of duke, and he thinks, how can this savage on the trees become a duke? I will never be able to make the case for it. So he's very mad at him, and this is one of their last confrontations.
Yeah, this is the 8th chapter. He's still a boy in this chapter, but I think it's self-evident. Just read it. In those days, Cosimo often challenged the people on the ground. Challenges of marksmanship, of dexterity, partly to test his own capabilities, what he could do from up in the treetops. He challenged the urchins to quoits. They were in the area near Porta Capari. Did I say that right? Thank you, thank you. Porta Capari, amid the hovels of the poor and the vagabonds. From a bare, half-dead home oak, Cosimo was playing quoits when he saw a tall, slightly bent man on horseback approaching, wrapped in a black cloak. He recognized his father. The rabble dispersed. From the doorways of the hovels, the women stood watching. Baron Arminio rode up under the tree. It was a red sunset. Cosimo was in the bare branches. They looked each other in the face. It was the first time since the lunch of snails that they had been like that, face to face. Many days had passed. Things had changed. Both knew that the snails had nothing to do with it anymore, nor did the obedience of sons and the authority of fathers, that of so many logical and sensible things that could be said, all would have been out of place, and yet they had to say something. "You're making a fine spectacle of yourself," the father began bitterly. "Very worthy of a gentleman." He had used the more formal you, as he did with more serious reproaches, but now that use had a sense of distance, of detachment. "A gentleman, father, sir, is such in the trees as on the ground," Cosimo answered, and immediately added, "if he behaves correctly." "A fine sentiment," the Baron admitted gravely, "although a short while ago you were stealing plums from a tenant farmer." It was true. My brother was caught out. What should he answer? He smiled, but not proudly or cynically. It was a timid smile, and he blushed. The father smiled too, a sad smile, and for some reason he too blushed. "Now you're in league with the worst bastards and beggars," he said then. "No, father, sir, I'm for myself, and each for himself," said Cosimo firmly. "I invite you to come down to earth," said the Baron in a peaceful, almost exhausted voice, "and resume the duties of your station." "I don't intend to obey you, father, sir," said Cosimo. "I'm sorry about it." They were both uneasy, bored. Each knew what the other would say. "But your studies and your duties as a Christian," said the father. "You mean to grow up like a savage of the Americas?" Cosimo was silent. There were thoughts that he hadn't yet put to himself and had no desire to. Then he said, "Just because I'm a few yards higher up, you think good teachings won't reach me?" This too was a clever answer, but it was already a sort of diminishing of the scope of his gesture, a sign of weakness, therefore. The father noticed it and pressed harder. "Rebellion is not measured in yards," he said. "Even when it seems just a few handbreadths, a journey may have no return." Now, my brother could have given some other lofty response, maybe a Latin maxim. None came to mind now, but at the time we knew a lot by heart. Instead, he had grown bored, sitting there acting serious. He stuck out his tongue and cried, "But from the trees I can pee farther," a phrase without much meaning, but which cut off the matter cleanly. A shout arose from the rascals at Porta Capari, as if they had heard that utterance. Il Barone del Rondo's horse shied. The Baron held the reins tight, wrapped himself in his cloak, as if ready to go. But he turned. He pulled one arm out from under the cloak, and pointing to the sky, which was rapidly filling with black clouds, exclaimed, "Watch out, son. There's one who can pee on all of us." And he spurred his horse away. I mean, it's such good writing. and such good writing and such good translation. I mean, it's just a pleasure to be around these words and these thoughts and the depth of understanding of people in the world. Just great.
Thank you. Maybe Mr. Gere mentioned the translation. Giovanna, you want to tell us something about this new translation that you wanted very strongly, and why so? And why do you think it's important?
Well, to translate an author, especially someone who died, many years ago, when you translate him anew, it's a bit like giving a new birth to the book. And it's making his voice fresher, because the original doesn't get old, but translations do get old. They get old quite quickly. And it's not easy to convince the publishers to make new translations, but anyway, for this one it worked, and Ann Goldstein is a wonderful translator. It's a pity that she couldn't be here tonight. She has no ego. She really receives the language and renders it in English. She translated Elena Ferrante, that became such a bestseller in the States, and she worked for many years.
And she edited the complete works of Primo Levi, and many other Italian writers.
Leopardi. Yeah. She's a wonderful translator. Yeah.
And I just wanted to
One thing, actually, this is the perfect time. When I was riding over here with my friend Jonathan, we were talking about translations, and he recounted paraphrased something from George Steiner about translators, and this is what, an act of translation is an act of love. When it fails, it betrays. When it succeeds, it incarnates.
Thank you for sharing this with us. And we're going to have time for a few questions from the audience. So while you think about your question, I just want to read a very, very short sentence. It's a quote from Umberto Eco that happened to be one of the people that was more enthusiastic about this book when it came out, despite, he said, some negative reactions, especially from the institutional left. And for Eco, this book represented a turning point in the Italian literary tradition. He says, this turning point was produced by the Baron in the Trees that had the persuasive power of a parable, the deep attractiveness of a myth, the charm of a fairy tale, and the gentle force of poetry. And I think he really summarizes it perfectly. And Giovanna, when we read this before, said, and it's also funny. And that's true. It's a book that you laugh with when you read it. So all these things plus laughter and the comic aspect.
When I read his books and my father's books, and I read them often because I check translations in French, and I always think how lucky I am that I'm his daughter, because he was so funny and he keeps being funny to me, and I could, be the daughter of a very self-important writer, and that would be a nightmare. So it's lucky.
Thank you, Giovanna. Yes, we have time for a few questions, if you have any. Yes.
I have a question for Dr. Calvino. While Cosimo lived in the trees, he had many experiences, met a lot of people. He participated in fire brigades, but he met Napoleon at one point, and he was very disappointed. And going back to the political side of the book, I was thinking, how disappointed was your father with growing up in fascism? How disappointed was with Mussolini, or maybe Stalin?
So when you said Napoleon and that he was disappointed, it made me think that my father admired Stendhal a lot, and he spoke about the way in which, in the Chartreuse de Parme, the Battle of Waterloo is described as a total disaster. And so maybe that's what he was channeling in his disappointment of Napoleon. And I don't know that he would pay the compliment to Mussolini to compare him with Napoleon.
Thank you. Any other question that, yes?
Yes, for Giovanna, I studied your father and was inspired with theater based on folk tales, but was he also inspired by Giambattista Basile, the Cameron?
Punto degli Conti.
Probably. Probably.
So then many years later, I'm thinking, was your father at all into esoteric studies? Because now, I read it when I was really young in Rome, but now.
A part of his library, he had a shelf that was all about esoteric literature. So yes, of course, yeah.
And the fairy tales, correct me if I'm wrong, Giovanna, are definitely inspired by the great Italian tradition of literary storytelling from il Centonovelle, Decameron, Punto degli Conti, Basile, and so on.
Of course.
But he did a lot also of field research. It's not only fairy tales that were written. He wanted to listen because many of them had only an oral tradition.
Yes.
So recording them and transcribing them from the dialect into the Italian. So it was also sort of anthropological research. Yeah.
Yes.
And many of them were just oral. So he rescued them from perpetual forgiveness by putting them in writing.
Yes.
And he was very aware of that, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's an important work that he did.
Yes?
For Mr. Gere, in this very divided and angry world, so how we can embrace emptiness?
How we can embrace emptiness in such a divided and angry world.
I mean, look, there's a few younger people here, but there are a lot of people who have seen a lot. None of us have seen anything like this. This is completely wacky crazy. I mean, it really is some weird dream. You wake up and you go, wow, that was a weird dream, right?
But it's real.
That's really weird. And I'm on a simple plane, we have to work that this man is not reelected, for sure. We have to take that responsibility. You know, on a larger level, if we don't feel our own vastness inside ourselves, we'll never see it outside of ourselves. That's just the law. It's the way it is. So from a Buddhist point of view, you do the work on yourself to break all of the bonds. And the word is liberation. I mean, it's literally liberated from dualism, from conceptual thinking, from literally selfish thinking, which even from a physics point of view, we don't exist in the way we appear to exist. Nothing appears in the way it appears to exist. And as vast as we can make our minds, we can then see the vastness of love, compassion, of forgiveness, of inclusion, and make that the world that we exist in the relative plane. But it starts with the work on yourself. That's 2 minutes.
Thank you. And before I ask Giovanna to close our evening with the citation that she is going to read from, I believe, your grandfather.
My grandfather,
Yes. I want to thank all of you for having been here, the people who are upstairs in the library and that are watching it on a big screen but not live, so thank you for your patience, the people who watched the live streaming, and the video is going to be available on our website in a short time. I think it was a great evening, and I'm very grateful to Giovanna Calvino. I've known Giovanna for more than 20 years, and she has always been a very private person and very shy and not willing to talk about her father in public. So I know it Was
In
it-
20 years, I've learned a bit.
But I know that for you it's still something that is costly, that is difficult, and that's why I'm very, very grateful, Giovanna, for having won your natural privacy about talking about you and your father, and having it done here with us. And of course,
Thank you, Stefano.
thanks to Mr.
Thank
Gere for
you.
having given voice to Italo Calvino tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. So my grandparents received letters from people who asked questions about their plants and about fertilizers and about anything that had to do with plants. And this book came out of all their answers. And there's a sentence of my grandfather, so my father's father, that says, we should be like the plants that entrust to the wind millions of seeds with the certainty that at least some of them will germinate.